The door slammed open so hard the wall behind it shook, and for a second I thought the sound had come from inside my chest, not the hallway. I was still sitting on the kitchen floor where the argument had ended, my cheek burning, my hands trembling around a cracked teacup I didn't even remember dropping. Shoes crossed the tiles quickly, familiar, urgent. And then his voice cut through the silence like a blade that refused to bend. "Mom." He stopped when he saw me. I didn't look up right away. I was too busy trying to pull my breathing back into something that didn't sound like fear. The room still smelled like perfume and anger, and behind him, near the counter, she stood. Perfectly composed, arms folded, chin lifted like nothing unusual had happened. The calm on her face unsettled him more than my tears did. "Mom, who did this?" he asked, quieter now, kneeling beside me, his hands hovering like he didn't know where to touch without hurting me more. I swallowed before answering, feeling the weight of every choice I had made to keep peace in this house. "Your fiancée," I said softly. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look embarrassed. Nerissa only laughed once, sharp, dismissive, and said, "Oh, please, don't make it dramatic. She knows how to push people." That was when I finally lifted my eyes and saw something shift inside my son. Not rage, not the loud anger I expected. Something colder, something that made even Winifred, standing near the doorway with that tight, superior smile, straighten slightly. He helped me sit in a chair without saying another word, his jaw locked. His gaze moving slowly from my face to Nerissa's expression as if he were studying a stranger. Weeks ago, he would have defended her instantly. Today, he said nothing. Silence wrapped around the kitchen like a warning. "You're overreacting," Nerissa added, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "If she can't accept that things are changing, that's not my fault." Her voice carried that smooth confidence that once charmed him, the same tone that had convinced him she was strong, capable, the woman who stood beside him when his business nearly collapsed. But now it sounded different, too polished, too practiced. He stood up slowly, taller than I remembered in that moment, and walked toward the window as if he needed distance to think. Winifred's eyes followed him carefully, measuring. I knew that look, and I had seen it years ago when people calculated what my son's future might bring them. My hands shook again, but not from pain, from the memory of something I had buried long ago, something tied to that woman and the secrets she thought nobody remembered. "Caleb," I whispered, not sure whether I wanted him to stay or leave, whether truth would protect him or break him. He didn't answer me. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket, stared at the screen for a long second, and then dialed a number I didn't recognize. No shouting, no threats. Just a quiet, steady voice that didn't belong to the boy I raised, but to a man who had learned how to make decisions without emotion. "I'm home," he said into the phone. "I need you here, now." Nerissa scoffed like it was a joke, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Do your worst," she said, her confidence filling the room like smoke, but I noticed the way Winifred's smile faltered, just for a second, as if she understood something her daughter didn't. Caleb ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and turned toward us with a calm that felt heavier than anger. He didn't explain who he had called. He didn't ask another question. He simply pulled a chair closer to mine and sat down beside me, waiting, as if whatever he had set in motion was already on its way, and whatever arrived at that door next would change this house forever. The first time I saw Nerissa, she was standing beside my son like a shield he didn't know he was hiding behind, her hand resting lightly on his arm while he explained to me how everything had almost collapsed. The investors pulling back, the sleepless nights, the fear that the business he built from nothing was slipping through his fingers. He said her name with gratitude back then, the way a man speaks about someone who arrived at the right moment. and I remember smiling because a mother wants to believe anyone who steadies her child must be good for him. Caleb was thinner in those days, eyes tired but hopeful, and she listened to him with a patience that felt rehearsed, yet comforting. "She kept me grounded," he told me one evening, voice softer than I'd heard in years. I watched the way she nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word, and I told myself that maybe this woman had brought him the kind of calm I could no longer give. But even then, something inside me stayed alert. Not loud, not accusing, just aware. And she asked questions that sounded supportive but always circled back to control. Who handled his finances? Who made decisions? Who advised him when he doubted himself? He never noticed the pattern. He only saw the warmth. The more he leaned on her during that difficult season, the more his voice changed when he spoke to me. Still loving, but slightly distant, like he was measuring my words against hers. Winifred appeared soon after, dressed in that careful elegance that made every room feel like a stage. She greeted me politely, calling me dear, with a smile that never reached her eyes. And from the beginning, she spoke as if she already understood my son's world better than I did. "Caleb needs people who see his vision," she said one afternoon while Narissa and Caleb laughed together across the living room, none her tone gentle but edged with meaning. I nodded, pretending not to notice how she positioned herself between us during conversations, subtly shifting topics whenever Caleb asked for my opinion. Over time, small moments began to accumulate, Narissa suggesting new routines, new traditions, new boundaries that felt harmless at first, but slowly redrew the lines inside this house. She praised him constantly, lifting him higher while quietly lowering the value of anyone who questioned her influence. I never challenged her openly because I remembered how fragile he had been during those early months, how grateful he sounded when he spoke about her loyalty. Instead, I watched. I watched how he began calling her before making decisions he once discussed with me, how her approval became the anchor he reached for when uncertainty crept in. And it wasn't love that worried me, it was dependency, the way she framed herself as the only person who truly understood his struggles. Winifred encouraged it, always with polite words that carried hidden edges. "A man needs a partner who helps him grow away from the past," she said once, glancing at me just long enough for the meaning to land. I smiled through it, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to want. But later that night, I sat alone and wondered whether Caleb realized how much of himself he had handed over without noticing. The day he announced their engagement, he looked lighter than I had seen him in years, and I hugged him tightly, whispering that I only wanted him to be happy. Narissa held my gaze then, calm, confident, unreadable, and for a brief second, I felt like an outsider in my own son's future. And I told myself it was just adjustment, just the normal shift that happens when a family grows. But deep down, beneath the pride and the quiet hope, there was a small, persistent discomfort I couldn't explain. The feeling that the woman he believed had saved him might one day become the very storm he never saw coming. The change didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly, disguised as help. At first it was small things, Narissa reorganizing the kitchen because she said it made more sense for Caleb's schedule, moving my spices into neat glass jars I never asked for, replacing the old kettle with a sleek machine that hissed louder than conversation. She called it efficiency. I called it adjustment. But slowly, the rhythm of my own home began to feel unfamiliar, like walking through a place designed for someone else's comfort. And Caleb barely noticed. He was busy, proud, relieved to have someone taking care of the details he didn't have time to manage. Narissa always framed her decisions as love for him, and that made it difficult to question anything without sounding unreasonable. Winifred watched from the edges, offering suggestions in that polished voice that made criticism sound like wisdom. "Change is healthy," she would say, smiling as if she were doing me a favor. I nodded more than I spoke, learning quickly that silence kept the peace longer than resistance ever did. Meals shifted to her schedule, conversations turned toward her interests, and even the living room, the place where Caleb once sat beside me talking about everything from business plans to childhood memories, became a space curated for appearances rather than comfort. The hardest part wasn't what she changed, it was how she changed it. No arguments, no shouting, just subtle corrections that made me feel outdated, misplaced. She would interrupt gently when I told a story Caleb already knew, finishing my sentences with a soft laugh that sounded kind but carried an edge. "We've heard that one," she'd say, and Caleb would smile distractedly, unaware of the way my words shrank before they reached the room. Winifred began hosting small gatherings without asking me, inviting people who looked at me like I was a guest instead of the woman who built the foundation of this house. I remember standing by the doorway one evening, watching them discuss renovations and future plans as if my presence was optional. When I offered an opinion, Narissa's smile tightened just enough to make me second-guess myself. "You worry too much," she said, touching Caleb's arm, and he nodded without thinking, trusting her certainty more than my hesitation. That was when I started feeling the walls shift, not physically, but emotionally, as if the home I knew was being rewritten line by line. My routines disappeared quietly. My favorite chair moved closer to the corner because she said it improved the room's balance. Even my morning tea felt different because she replaced the brand I had used for years with something more expensive that tasted like nothing. The disrespect never came as a loud insult. It lived in the pauses, in the way she spoke over me when guests arrived, in the subtle reminders that this was now her space too, maybe even more hers than mine. Caleb still hugged me the same way, still called me Mom with warmth. But I could see how easily he adapted to the new order she created. He didn't realize that every small change carried a message, that my place here was slowly becoming temporary. And I kept quiet because I told myself, love sometimes meant stepping back, letting the next chapter unfold without resistance. But deep inside, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear of her, but fear of disappearing entirely from a life I had spent decades building. By the time the argument finally happened, the house already felt different. It had stopped being a place where my voice mattered and started becoming a stage where I watched my own role fade into the background, replaced by someone who smiled sweetly while quietly rewriting the rules I once lived by. Winifred didn't enter the house like a visitor. She arrived like someone reviewing a property she believed already belonged to her daughter's future. The morning she settled into the guest room, she walked through every space slowly, eyes sharp but smiling, pausing just long enough to make her observations feel like compliments instead of inspections. "Such a beautiful home," she said, fingertips grazing the edge of the dining table, though a little traditional. I heard the word the way she intended it, not praise, but a quiet suggestion that time had moved past me. Caleb welcomed her warmly, grateful for her attention, unaware of how quickly the energy shifted once she began speaking about structure and boundaries. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. And her authority lived in the way she framed every conversation as if she were offering wisdom earned from years of navigating powerful circles. During dinner that night, she spoke about how successful men required environments that reflected their growth, glancing at Narissa as if passing an invisible torch. "When a son builds something extraordinary," she said, stirring her tea gently, "the family must evolve with him. Otherwise, old habits hold him back." Caleb nodded thoughtfully, and Narissa watched me with a small, satisfied smile that felt less like affection and more like alignment. From that moment, their alliance became unmistakable. Decisions started flowing through quiet side conversations between mother and daughter, whispered plans about redecorating, hosting events, even discussing Caleb's schedule without asking him directly, as if they were shaping the world around him while he stood at its center, unaware. I noticed how Winifred would redirect his attention whenever I offered an opinion, gently reframing my words as sentimental rather than practical. "Dolores speaks from love," she'd say softly, her tone warm enough to avoid offense, "but we must also think strategically." The word strategically lingered, turning my lived experience into something outdated. Nerissa absorbed that language quickly, echoing it whenever she wanted to override me. The generational shift felt deliberate, not loud rebellion, but a steady rewriting of roles where I was slowly repositioned as the past and they represented the future. Even small moments carried weight. One afternoon, while Caleb was out, Winifred rearranged the sitting room again, explaining that certain spaces should reflect the couple's vision, not history. She said it kindly, almost maternally, but the message was clear. I was no longer the center of this household story. When guests visited, she introduced me with polite distance, Caleb's mother, of course, while highlighting Nerissa as the woman guiding his next chapter. I began to see how their partnership worked. Nerissa brought emotional influence, Winifred provided strategic pressure, and together they formed a united front that left little room for disagreement. Caleb remained oblivious to the deeper shift, trusting that everyone simply wanted the best for him. But I saw the pattern, how Winifred praised him in ways that subtly separated him from me, an encouraging independence that felt more like detachment. "A man becomes who he chooses to listen to," she told him one evening, her eyes resting briefly on me before returning to him. It wasn't an argument. It was a declaration disguised as guidance. And as the days passed, the house felt less like a shared home and more like a stage where a new hierarchy was quietly being installed, one polite conversation at a time. By the end of that week, I realized something I had been avoiding. This wasn't just about Nerissa finding her place beside my son. It was about Winifred teaching her how to claim space, how to reshape family dynamics until the old foundation seemed unnecessary. And the most unsettling part wasn't their confidence. It was how natural it all looked to Caleb, who believed he was simply surrounded by women who loved him, never suspecting that love, when guided by ambition, could quietly redraw the lines of an entire family. The argument didn't begin as a storm. It started with a sentence spoken too calmly to sound dangerous. Nerissa stood near the kitchen counter, flipping through a folder of documents Caleb had left behind after his last meeting, her expression thoughtful in that way she used when she wanted control to look like concern. "We need to talk about the future of this house," she said, her voice smooth, almost gentle. I remember placing my teacup down carefully because something in her tone told me this wasn't a conversation meant for compromise. Winifred sat at the table watching quietly, fingers folded, eyes alert like she had been waiting for this moment to arrive. I asked what she meant, and Nerissa smiled in that polished way that made disagreement feel unreasonable. She spoke about growth, about how Caleb's success meant everything around him needed to reflect a higher standard. New investments, new structures, new decisions that prioritized the life they were building together. At first it sounded like planning, but then she mentioned inheritance, suggesting that clarity now would prevent confusion later. The way she said confusion made my chest tighten. It wasn't concern, it was calculation. I told her gently that Caleb's future wasn't something to divide like a business asset, that family wasn't a negotiation table. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're thinking emotionally," she said, and Winifred added, "Dolores, like sometimes love means stepping back so the next generation can lead." The words landed heavier than they intended because they weren't just advice. They were instructions. I felt something shift inside me then, a quiet resistance I had kept hidden for weeks finally pushing forward. I told them this house wasn't a symbol of status, it was history, sacrifice, and years of work they hadn't witnessed. Nerissa's smile faded slightly, replaced by impatience. She began listing reasons why change was necessary. How Caleb needed a partner who could manage his legacy without hesitation. How certain emotional attachments slowed progress. The room grew smaller with every sentence. I remember standing up, not to argue, but to protect a boundary that had been quietly eroded. "This is still my home," I said, my voice steady even though my hands trembled. That was when the conversation tipped from polite disagreement into something sharper. Nerissa stepped closer, her eyes bright with a confidence that felt rehearsed. "It won't always be," she replied, and Winifred didn't interrupt. She only watched, silent approval sitting in the space between them. The air thickened with unspoken resentment, years of ambition, expectation, and the belief that success rewrote every rule that came before it. I don't remember every word that followed. Arguments blur when emotion rises too quickly. I only remember the moment her frustration broke through the careful composure she usually maintained. A sudden movement, a harsh gesture meant to push past me, and the world tilting for a second longer than it should have. It wasn't loud or dramatic, on just a loss of balance and a shock that left me sitting on the floor, breath shallow, the room spinning with disbelief more than pain. Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. Nerissa's expression hardened instead of softening, and Winifred finally stood, her voice low and controlled. "This wouldn't have happened if you understood your place," she said, not unkindly, but without apology. I realized then that the argument had never been about misunderstanding. It had been about authority. They believed the future belonged to them, and I was simply standing in the way. As I sat there trying to steady myself, a memory rose from somewhere I had buried years ago. A conversation in a crowded office, Winifred's voice whispering promises about protecting reputations, about keeping certain truths hidden for the sake of Caleb's future. When I had pushed that memory aside for so long that it felt unreal now, like a shadow stepping back into the light. And as Nerissa turned away dismissively, I felt a cold realization settle over me. This moment wasn't random anger. It was the echo of something much older, something tied to Winifred's past, something I had once chosen to hide, believing silence would keep my son safe. The knock came softer than I expected. 3 measured taps that didn't carry urgency but authority, and the moment Caleb stood to open the door, I felt the air in the house tighten, like something unseen had finally arrived to witness what words alone could not explain. A tall man stepped inside, dressed plainly, his eyes moving across the room with quiet precision before settling briefly on me. Then on Nerissa and Winifred, as if he were reading a story written in silence. Caleb didn't introduce him with drama. He simply said, "Thank you for coming." And that was when I understood the call he made earlier had not been a reaction, but a decision already forming long before he returned home. Nerissa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her chin lifting higher, her smile returning like armor. But there was a flicker beneath it, a quick calculation that told me she had not expected this kind of response. Winifred, however, watched the man carefully, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal recognition of the situation, if not the person. The investigator spoke calmly, asking simple questions, his voice neutral in a way that made even ordinary sentences feel heavier. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise his tone. Instead, he observed. The overturned chair, the tension in Caleb's shoulders, the way Nerissa crossed her arms as if defending an invisible boundary. Caleb stood beside me, closer than he had been in weeks, and I realized then that he had been watching more than I gave him credit for. The small changes, the quiet dismissals, the way I had grown quieter inside my own home. "I just want clarity," he said, and those words held more weight than anger ever could. Nerissa laughed lightly, brushing her hair back as if the situation were ridiculous. "You hired someone to investigate a misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with disbelief. The investigator didn't respond to her tone. He only took notes, asking about timelines, conversations, expectations. Winifred tried to guide the narrative, stepping forward with practiced composure. "Families argue," she said gently, positioning herself between her daughter and the man as if she could control the direction of his attention. But Caleb didn't look at her. He watched Nerissa instead, waiting, and I saw something shift in his eyes. Not rejection, not yet, but awareness growing quietly beneath the surface. For the first time since the confrontation, Nerissa hesitated before speaking, her confidence faltering just long enough for doubt to enter the room. I felt it then, the slow unraveling of certainty, and it frightened me as much as it relieved me, because I knew investigations didn't just reveal truth. They exposed everything connected to it, including secrets I had kept buried for years. The investigator asked me to describe what happened, and as I spoke, I noticed Caleb listening differently, not with the distracted patience he had shown recently, but with a stillness that meant he was finally hearing me without interruption. Nerissa's eyes darted briefly toward Winifred, a silent exchange passing between them that confirmed their alliance ran deeper than I once believed. When the investigator mentioned reviewing financial records and prior communications, for context, Winifred's smile tightened, and that was when I realized Caleb had not acted impulsively. He had been preparing for this moment, gathering pieces quietly while pretending nothing had changed. The room felt smaller as questions unfolded, each one peeling away another layer of assumption. Nerissa tried to regain control by shifting the conversation back to emotion, accusing me of exaggeration. But the calm structure of the investigation made her words sound thin. Caleb remained silent, his presence steady beside me, and I felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness because the boy who once avoided conflict had learned to face it without raising his voice. As the investigator closed his notebook and said he would begin reviewing background information connected to everyone involved, the house fell into a tense quiet that felt like the pause before a storm you can't see yet. Nerissa's confidence returned outwardly, but I could see the crack beneath it. The realization that this situation was no longer a private argument she could reshape with charm. And as Caleb met my eyes briefly, a silent reassurance passing between us. I understood something that both comforted and unsettled me. He had noticed far more than I believed, and whatever truth the investigation uncovered would not only change how he saw Nerissa, it might also force me to reveal the past I had spent years protecting him from. There are memories you don't revisit because they hurt too loudly. You leave them where they fell and pretend time has buried them deep enough to stay quiet. But the moment that investigator stepped into my home, I felt the past stirring like a secret that refused to remain still. Caleb thinks his success came from grit and timing alone, and he's not wrong. But what he doesn't know is how close everything came to breaking years ago, long before Nerissa ever entered his life. Back then, his company was still fragile. Investors watched him like hawks waiting for weakness, and one careless rumor could have turned ambition into scandal overnight. And I remember sitting across from Winifred in a crowded office, her voice low and controlled, explaining that her family was dealing with temporary complications, financial decisions that had drawn attention they could not afford. She spoke like a strategist even then, choosing words carefully, never admitting fault directly. But I understood enough to realize Caleb's name had been pulled into something dangerous through association alone. It wasn't fraud in the dramatic sense people imagine. It was influence, risky loans, and a network of favors that could easily be misinterpreted if exposed at the wrong moment. Caleb had worked too hard to become collateral damage in someone else's mess, and Winifred knew it. She looked at me that day, not as an equal, but as a mother she believed would do anything to shield her son. She wasn't wrong, and I agreed to help contain the narrative, not by lying, but by redirecting attention, by stepping forward in ways that kept Caleb's reputation clean while questions faded quietly into the background. I told myself it was temporary, that protecting him was worth any discomfort, but silence has a way of reshaping the future when you least expect it. For years, Winifred carried herself with gratitude that never quite reached her eyes. She respected me enough to keep the peace, yet there was always an unspoken understanding between us, a debt that existed without being named. When Nerissa appeared later, I recognized echoes of that same confidence, the belief that strategy mattered more than sentiment. I never told Caleb about the scandal because I wanted him to move forward without the weight of old complications dragging behind him. Every time he praised Nerissa for standing by him during difficult moments, I swallowed my unease, reminding myself that love often arrives through imperfect paths. But now, watching Winifred stand calmly while her daughter pushed boundaries inside my home, I realized how my silence had shaped this dynamic. They knew I understood their history, yet they trusted that I would never speak. Because I never had. That was the cruelest part. My choice to protect my son had also given them confidence that I would endure disrespect quietly, believing I valued harmony more than truth. Sitting alone after the investigator left the room, I felt the weight of that decision pressing against my chest. I had carried this secret like a shield, convinced it preserved Caleb's future. But now I wondered if it had simply delayed a confrontation that needed to happen long ago. The memory of Winifred's whispered promises resurfaced clearly. Her assurance that family loyalty would always be honored, that she understood a mother's sacrifice. Looking at her now, standing beside Nerissa with unwavering composure, I realized those promises were never meant to protect me. They were meant to secure my silence. And as the house settled into uneasy quiet, I understood something that frightened me more than the investigation itself. If the truth finally came to light, Caleb would not only see Nerissa differently, he would see me differently too, and I wasn't sure whether he would understand that every secret I kept was born from love, not weakness. The house felt quieter after the investigator left, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that makes every glance carry meaning. Caleb didn't confront anyone immediately. Instead, he moved through the day with a calm focus I hadn't seen before, watching, listening, noticing details that once slipped past him. Nerissa sensed the shift, too. She softened her tone, lowered her voice, and replaced the sharp confidence she had shown earlier with a gentler presence that felt almost rehearsed. Where she had once stood, firm and unapologetic, she now hovered close to him, brushing her fingers against his arm, asking if he was all right, reminding him how much she had stood beside him when nobody else understood his pressure. It was subtle, but I recognized the change. Dominance melting into vulnerability, control disguised as comfort. Caleb responded carefully, not rejecting her warmth, but no longer leaning into it without thought. I watched him pause before answering questions, his eyes lingering on her expressions as if he were trying to understand something that didn't quite fit anymore. The smallest inconsistencies began to surface, details about the argument that didn't align, timelines that shifted slightly each time she spoke, explanations that sounded polished but incomplete. Nerissa laughed them off, framing his doubts as stress from work, reminding him of the nights she stayed awake helping him prepare for presentations. the way she defended him when critics questioned his vision. Her words were powerful because they were true. She'd been there during his hardest season, and that truth made it harder for him to separate gratitude from trust. I could see the conflict growing inside him, the quiet battle between loyalty to the woman he loved and the instinct to protect the woman who raised him. He didn't accuse her directly, he asked questions instead, gentle ones that carried more weight than confrontation. "Why didn't you tell me things felt tense here?" he asked at one point, and she sighed softly, leaning into him like someone wounded by the question itself. "Because I didn't want to come between you and your mother," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. It was a careful response, turning doubt into guilt, making him feel responsible for her discomfort. Winifred watched these exchanges closely, stepping in occasionally to reinforce the narrative that Nerissa had only been trying to maintain order in a complicated household. Caleb listened, but he no longer accepted every word without pause. I noticed how he started spending more time alone, scrolling through old messages, replaying memories that once felt clear but now seemed layered with new meaning. The tension wasn't loud. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the way he hesitated before reaching for her hand, in the quiet distance that grew even when they sat in the same room. Nerissa adapted quickly, shifting from assertive partner to fragile ally, reminding him how much she had sacrificed to be part of his life. "I'm not the enemy here," she whispered one evening, her eyes glossy with unshed tears, and for a moment I saw him soften, the old bond pulling him back toward her. But then he glanced at me, and something in his expression changed again, uncertainty replacing certainty. Love and control began to blur together, and I realized the investigation wasn't just about uncovering facts. It was forcing Caleb to confront the possibility that the woman he believed had saved him might also be shaping his world in ways he never questioned. That realization didn't break him. It slowed him down, made him listen more carefully, and as he sat quietly that night staring out the window, I understood that the greatest conflict wasn't between him and Nerissa at all. It was inside him. The struggle to decide whether the foundation of their relationship had been built on genuine partnership or on a dependence he was only now beginning to see clearly. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon, carried in quietly by the investigator as if it were nothing more than routine paperwork. But the way Caleb straightened when he saw it told me he already sensed its weight. No one spoke at first. Nerissa sat perfectly still on the edge of the sofa, fingers interlocked so tightly her knuckles had turned pale, while Winifred maintained her usual composure, chin lifted, eyes calm. The posture of someone who believed control was a matter of appearance. The investigator placed the documents on the table with a soft, deliberate motion, explaining that they were preliminary findings. Nothing final yet, only connections that required clarification. Caleb flipped through the pages slowly, his brow tightening as numbers and names lined up in ways that didn't match the story we had been told. I watched the shift happen in real time. Confusion first, then recognition, and then a quiet disbelief that made him glance toward Winifred as if hoping she would offer an explanation before he had to ask for one. She didn't. Instead, she folded her hands neatly and waited, as though patience itself could reshape the narrative. Nerissa leaned forward, attempting to laugh off the tension. "This feels excessive," she said lightly, but her voice carried an edge that betrayed her unease. The investigator spoke calmly, pointing out a series of financial obligations tied to Winifred's business ventures, loans structured through shell partnerships, delayed repayments, and subtle dependencies that connected indirectly to Caleb's expanding assets. Nothing illegal on its face, he clarified, but enough to suggest that certain expectations about the future had been built long before anyone discussed marriage openly. And the room felt smaller as Caleb absorbed the information. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" he asked quietly, not accusing, just searching. Winifred's smile softened, and she leaned back slightly, choosing her words with the same precision I remembered from years ago. "I didn't want to burden you," she replied, her tone warm, almost maternal. "Families support each other differently. I assumed you understood that partnerships come with shared growth." The phrasing was careful, not denial, not confession, just enough truth to make confrontation feel complicated. Nerissa's confidence flickered then, a quick glance toward her mother revealing the depth of what she might not have known herself. The realization that her mother's stability was tied to Caleb's success shifted something in her posture, turning certainty into quiet calculation. Caleb continued turning pages, his movements slow and deliberate, and I saw the moment he understood that the future being planned around him wasn't only about love, it was also about security for people whose lives had become intertwined with his success. The twist wasn't loud, it lived in the silence that followed each new detail. The realization that Winifred's influence hadn't been about control alone, but survival wrapped in elegance. She finally spoke again, her voice steady. "Every family protects its interests," she said, looking directly at Caleb. "I only wanted Nerissa to build a life where she never had to struggle the way I did." For the first time, I heard something beneath her composure. Not regret, but a kind of weary honesty that complicated the image of a simple antagonist. Nerissa shifted closer to Caleb then, and her hand brushing his sleeve as if trying to anchor him back to familiarity. "This doesn't change how I feel about you," she whispered, but the words sounded less like reassurance and more like urgency. Caleb didn't pull away, yet he didn't lean into her either. He closed the folder slowly, his eyes thoughtful rather than angry, and the calmness of his reaction unsettled everyone more than shouting ever could. The investigator stepped back, allowing the silence to settle, and I felt the psychological weight of the moment press against all of us. Not just a revelation of hidden debts, but a deeper understanding of why Winifred had pushed so hard to redefine this household. It wasn't only ambition, it was fear disguised as strategy. And as Nerissa watched her carefully constructed certainty begin to unravel, and I realized that whatever came next would not be a simple battle between right and wrong. It would be a confrontation between love, survival, and the truth none of us could avoid any longer. The house felt heavier after the documents were revealed, like every word spoken now carried consequences that none of us could pretend away. Caleb didn't confront me immediately, but I could feel his attention shifting. The way he watched me longer than usual, the way his questions started circling around things I had never explained. It happened late that evening, when the rooms had quieted and the tension settled into something almost fragile. He sat across from me at the dining table, the same place where so many ordinary conversations had once felt simple. "There's more you're not telling me," he said gently, not accusing, just searching. I hesitated, feeling the past press against my throat, unsure how much truth would protect him and how much might fracture what little balance remained. I didn't reveal everything, not yet, but I spoke enough for him to sense the depth of what had been hidden. I told him that years ago, when his business was just beginning to grow, there were moments when reputations mattered more than facts, when one rumor could erase years of work. His eyes narrowed slightly, trying to connect my words to the present. "You're saying you protected me from something?" he asked, confusion softening his voice. Before I could answer fully, Nerissa stepped into the room, her presence shifting the air instantly. She had been listening from the hallway. I could see it in the tension around her eyes. "So, now you're rewriting history?" she said, her tone calm but edged with disbelief. Caleb turned toward her, surprised, and I felt the conversation slip away from me before I could finish it. And she crossed her arms, her posture defensive yet composed, and for the first time since the investigation began, her vulnerability gave way to sharp accusation. This is exactly what I was afraid of, she continued, looking directly at Caleb. She's trying to make you doubt everything we've built together. The words landed harder than I expected because they were aimed not at me but at his loyalty. Caleb frowned, glancing between us, caught in a moment where truth felt tangled with emotion. I tried to explain that my silence had always been about protecting him, but Nerissa interrupted gently, her voice trembling just enough to sound wounded. Every time things get difficult, she brings up the past like a weapon, she said, stepping closer to him. How are we supposed to move forward if she keeps pulling you backward? The room filled with a quiet intensity that made breathing feel heavier. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He asked questions instead, trying to hold both realities at once, the woman he loved and the mother who had sacrificed for him. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, and I felt the weight of years settle into that single sentence. I told him I wanted him to grow without carrying burdens that weren't his, that sometimes love meant standing in the shadows so someone else could walk in the light. He listened, but doubt lingered in his eyes. Not doubt of me entirely, but confusion about how to reconcile the pieces. Nerissa moved closer, placing her hand gently against his arm, her expression softening into sadness. We're supposed to be planning a future together, she whispered, not fighting ghosts from the past. Her words shifted the emotional balance again, framing my truth as an obstacle rather than a revelation. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly, and I saw the conflict inside him deepen. Gratitude pulling him toward me, love pulling him toward her. Winifred watched silently from the doorway, her composure unshaken, as if she understood that this moment was more powerful than any argument. The escalation didn't come from shouting. It came from the realization that truth itself could feel like betrayal, depending on who heard it first. Caleb finally stood, pacing slowly across the room, the tension visible in the way his shoulders tightened. "I need to understand everything," he said quietly, more to himself than to either of us. And Nerissa's gaze hardened then, a flash of frustration slipping through her carefully controlled expression. "And I need you to see what's happening," she replied, her voice low but urgent. "She's trying to break us apart because she doesn't want to let you go." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and personal, and I felt a sharp ache knowing that my attempt to tell the truth had become a threat to the life he was building. As Caleb looked at me again, searching for clarity, I realized the most painful part of this moment wasn't the doubt in his eyes. It was the knowledge that love sometimes forces people to stand on opposite sides of the same truth, unsure which version will survive when everything finally comes into the light. The house didn't grow quiet all at once. The silence settled slowly. Like a heavy curtain lowering over every room until even footsteps sounded cautious. Caleb spent most of that evening near the window, his phone resting face down on the table, his thoughts moving somewhere neither Nerissa nor I could follow. No one argued anymore, and that was what made the tension sharper. Nerissa changed her approach completely. Where she had once met conflict with confidence, she now moved through the space with softness, speaking gently, choosing her moments carefully. She brought him tea without being asked, touched his shoulder in passing, laughed quietly at memories only the two of them shared. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like reconciliation, but I felt the shift underneath it, the subtle narrowing of emotional space around him, or in the way she guided conversations away from me without appearing obvious. Winifred remained mostly silent, observing from her seat with a calm that felt strategic, letting her daughter lead the moment as if this were a final test of influence. Caleb listened to Nerissa more than he spoke, his expression thoughtful but guarded, and I realized he was no longer reacting instinctively. He was measuring everything, weighing love against doubt. Later that night, When the lights were dim and the house felt smaller, Nerissa asked him to step into the living room alone. I didn't follow, but their voices carried just enough for me to understand the direction she was pushing. She spoke about loyalty, about how relationships survive only when partners choose each other first. Her tone was soft, almost pleading. And I could imagine the way she looked at him, eyes shining with vulnerability, voice trembling just enough to feel sincere. "You can't keep standing in the middle," she said quietly. "Either we build our life together, or we let old fears keep pulling you back." The words were careful, never mentioning me directly, but the meaning was clear. Caleb didn't answer immediately. I heard the faint sound of him pacing, the floor creaking beneath his weight, as if even the house was holding its breath. Nerissa continued, weaving memories into her argument. The nights she stayed awake while he doubted himself, the risks she claimed to have taken for him, the future she described in soft, hopeful detail. It wasn't anger, it was emotional gravity, pulling him closer through shared history rather than force. I sat alone at the dining table. My hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold, feeling the distance between us stretch further with every passing minute. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt unsure, not of the truth, but of whether love might still persuade him to turn away from it. When they returned to the main room, Nerissa's expression was calm again, almost serene, as if she had regained the balance she thought she was losing. She didn't look at me directly. Instead, she sat close to Caleb, her shoulder brushing his in quiet claim. Winifred's gaze flickered between us, satisfaction hidden behind politeness. Caleb remained silent, his eyes distant, and I could see the weight of the decision pressing against him, even though he hadn't spoken it aloud. And the suspense lived in that silence, the sense that something irreversible was unfolding beneath calm faces and measured breaths. Hours passed without confrontation, and the quiet grew heavier, turning every glance into a question nobody wanted to ask. I realized then that Nerissa's last power move wasn't meant to win an argument. It was meant to reshape his emotional center, to make him feel that choosing her meant choosing stability, while choosing me meant reopening wounds from the past. And as the night deepened and Caleb finally stood alone in the hallway, staring at nothing, I felt a strange stillness settle inside me. The understanding that the real battle was no longer loud or visible. It was happening quietly inside his heart, where love and doubt were wrestling for space. And whatever decision formed, there would decide not just the future of this house, but the truth he was finally ready to face. The shift didn't arrive with shouting or dramatic confession. It crept in through the smallest crack in Winifred's composure. Until that morning, she had moved through the house like someone certain of the ground beneath her feet, her words measured, her posture unshaken. But when the investigator returned with a thin folder and spoke quietly about formal reviews, potential legal exposure, and the need for transparency, something in her eyes changed. Not anger, not denial, but fear, disguised as irritation. She interrupted more than usual, asking sharp questions she didn't wait to hear answers to, her voice tightening each time the word liability entered the conversation. Caleb watched carefully, saying little, and I realized he was no longer looking for reassurance from her. He was observing her reactions the way a man studies a puzzle he finally understands might be missing pieces. Nerissa sat beside her mother at first, chin lifted in solidarity, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders when Winifred began speaking too quickly, revealing more anxiety than control. "This is unnecessary," Winifred said, her smile thin as she gestured toward the documents. "Families resolve matters privately." The investigator remained calm, explaining that certain financial connections required clarity regardless of intention, and that was when the illusion of authority began to slip. Winifred's confidence had always rested on precision, on knowing exactly how much to reveal and when. but now she seemed uncertain where to stand, or glancing toward Nerissa for reinforcement that didn't come as quickly as before. Nerissa's expression shifted from unity to calculation, her eyes flicking toward Caleb as if measuring how much of her future depended on which side she chose. The fracture between them appeared quietly, a pause before Nerissa spoke, a hesitation that told me she was no longer entirely certain her mother's strategy would protect her. "Mom, maybe we should just answer the questions," she murmured, her voice low but firm enough to land. Winifred turned toward her, surprise flashing across her face before it hardened into something colder. For the first time since she arrived, she looked alone. The room felt heavier with every passing second as the investigator outlined the possibility of deeper reviews. Nothing accusatory, only procedural, but the language itself carried weight. Winifred's hands tightened around the edge of the table, her carefully maintained elegance cracking under pressure. She began speaking more personally then, abandoning the polished distance she had held for weeks. "Everything I've done has been for my daughter," she said, her voice softer but edged with urgency. "I refuse to let her live a life where uncertainty could take everything away." Caleb listened without interrupting, and I could see the realization settling into him, that what once looked like ambition was also fear, a desperate attempt to secure stability through influence rather than trust. Nerissa shifted slightly away from her mother, not dramatically, but enough to signal distance. The alliance that had once felt unbreakable now looked fragile, strained by the possibility of consequences neither of them could control. Winifred noticed the change immediately. Her eyes lingered on Nerissa with a mixture of disappointment and quiet accusation, as if betrayal had come from within her own circle rather than from us. The authority she carried when she first arrived, the sense that she could reshape this household with a few well-placed words, faded into something more human, more uncertain. For a moment, she looked tired, like a woman who had spent years fighting battles nobody else saw and was only now realizing the cost. Nerissa tried to regain balance, speaking carefully to Caleb about misunderstandings, about intentions that had been misread, but the confidence behind her words no longer felt absolute. The shift wasn't loud, it lived in the distance between mother and daughter, when in the way their shared certainty fractured under the weight of reality. And as Winifred finally fell silent, her gaze fixed on the documents she could no longer dismiss, I understood that the power dynamic in this house had changed permanently, not because anyone raised their voice, but because fear had finally revealed itself, stripping away the illusion of control and leaving behind two women who were no longer standing on the same side of the same story. The truth had lived inside me for so long that speaking it felt like breaking something fragile I had spent years protecting. Caleb stood across from me in the living room, the quiet stretching between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Nerissa sat a few steps away, her posture still but tense, while Winifred remained near the window. That her gaze lowered as if she already sensed what was coming. I didn't begin with accusations or anger. I began with memory. "Before your company grew," I said softly, "there was a time when people were looking for reasons to doubt you, when one rumor could have closed every door you worked so hard to open." Caleb frowned slightly, trying to place himself back in that season, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. I told him about the meeting years ago, the one he never knew happened. When Winifred came to me quietly, explaining that certain financial risks tied to her family's network were drawing attention that could spill over onto him simply because of proximity. There were investors watching, reporters asking questions, and a narrative forming that could have painted him as careless before he even had the chance to prove himself. and I explained how I chose to step forward, to redirect conversations, to shield him from scrutiny by taking responsibility for decisions that were never mine to carry. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't dramatic, but it was heavy enough that if exposed at the wrong moment, it could have shattered his credibility before his success ever had the chance to grow. Caleb listened without interrupting, his expression slowly changing from confusion to disbelief. "You carried that alone?" he asked quietly, and I nodded, feeling the weight of years press against my chest. I told him I never wanted him to see the world as something that needed protection from his own ambition. I wanted him to believe he had built everything without shadows following him. Nerissa shifted then, her eyes searching his face, and I could see the realization forming inside her that the past she thought belonged only to her mother had always included me too. "This is being twisted," she said carefully, her voice steady but strained. "My family didn't ask for anything that would hurt you." I didn't argue with her. I only spoke about choices, about how silence can sometimes be the strongest form of love, and how protecting someone doesn't always mean standing beside them where they can see you. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly, the truth reshaping memories he once trusted. "All this time," he murmured, I thought she was the one who held me together back then." His words weren't cruel, just honest, and I felt the ache behind them because I had never tried to compete with the comfort Nerissa gave him. "She did help you," I said gently, "but love doesn't always look like being the loudest person in the room." The realization settled into him slowly, not as anger toward her, but as clarity about how much of his world had been built on incomplete understanding. Nerissa stepped closer, reaching for his hand, her voice softening into urgency. "None of this changes what we are," she whispered. "You can't let old stories make you question us." But Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked at me differently now, not just as his mother, but as someone who had stood between him and consequences he never even knew existed. The room felt heavier with every breath, and for a moment, no one moved. Winifred finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "She kept her word," she said, glancing at me with something that almost resembled respect. "I never expected you to tell him." Caleb turned toward her slowly, and I saw the last piece fall into place. The realization that love had made him overlook patterns he would have questioned in anyone else. It wasn't rage that filled his eyes. It was grief, the kind that comes when trust shifts shape in a single moment. He stepped back, creating a distance between himself and Nerissa that hadn't existed before, and I felt the emotional twist settle over all of us. The understanding that truth, once spoken, doesn't just reveal the past, it redraws the meaning of every choice that followed. Caleb didn't raise his voice when he asked Nerissa to sit with him. That was what made the moment heavier than any argument we had endured before. The house felt still, every sound softened by the tension that lingered from the truth finally spoken. And he stood near the window for a long time before turning toward her, hands in his pockets, eyes steady but distant. Nerissa met his gaze with quiet composure, though I could see the strain beneath it, the way her shoulders lifted slightly, as if she were bracing for something she couldn't control anymore. Winifred remained in the background, silent for once, watching the exchange unfold without interference. Caleb spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "I don't want a fight," he said. "I just want honesty." It wasn't an accusation. It was a boundary. Nerissa nodded, her expression softening into something almost fragile. "I've always been honest with you," she replied, though the confidence in her voice felt thinner than before. He didn't argue with her statement directly. Instead, he described how the past few days had changed the way he saw things, how pieces that once felt separate now connected in ways he couldn't ignore. "I trusted the way you stood beside me," he said quietly, but I didn't see how much of my world was being shaped around me. The words landed without anger, yet they carried weight. Nerissa exhaled slowly, her composure wavering just enough to reveal the vulnerability she usually hid behind charm. "I never wanted to control you," she whispered. "I wanted to protect what we were building." For a moment, she looked less like the confident partner who had walked into this house weeks ago, and more like someone afraid of losing the future she had imagined. Caleb listened without interrupting, his calmness forcing her to keep speaking without the shield of defensiveness. And she admitted that she had pushed too hard, that her mother's fears about security had influenced her decisions, but she insisted that her love for him had always been real. The honesty felt incomplete, yet sincere, a mixture of ambition and emotion that blurred the line between strategy and genuine attachment. He nodded slowly, acknowledging her words without fully accepting them. "Love doesn't mean reshaping people until they fit your vision," he said, his tone gentle but firm. The statement hung in the air like a quiet verdict. Nerissa's mask slipped then, not dramatically, but in the way her eyes filled with something deeper than frustration. "You think I'm the villain now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think everything I did was calculation." He shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "And I think you were afraid. And I didn't see it because I wanted us to be strong." The clarity in his voice shifted the power in the room. For the first time, he wasn't reacting to her emotions. He was defining his own. She reached for his hand, hesitating when he didn't immediately move closer. That small pause said more than any argument could have. The engagement ring caught the light between them, a silent reminder of promises made under different circumstances. Winifred watched quietly, her expression unreadable, as if recognizing that this was no longer a battle she could guide. Nerissa's vulnerability surfaced fully then, her ambition no longer hidden behind composure. "I thought if I made everything perfect," she said softly, "you would never feel the chaos I grew up with." The confession changed the energy of the conversation. It didn't erase the damage, but it revealed the fear behind her actions. Caleb's eyes softened briefly, understanding flickering across his face, yet he didn't step closer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with realization. He didn't announce a decision. He simply allowed the space between them to remain, refusing to fill it with comfort or finality. And as the room settled into that quiet uncertainty, I understood that the true reversal of power hadn't come from anger or punishment. It came from clarity, from a man who finally saw the woman he loved without illusion, and from a woman who realized that love alone might not be enough to hold a future together once truth had reshaped everything they thought they knew. The house felt different the morning after everything settled. Not brighter, not lighter, just calmer, like a place that had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. No one rushed to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. Caleb moved through the kitchen slowly, making tea the way he used to years ago, the small familiar rhythm grounding him in something that didn't depend on power or expectation. Nerissa and Winifred had already packed quietly. There were no dramatic exits, no slammed doors, only the soft closing of suitcases and the faint echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to this space. When Caleb returned to the living room, he sat beside me without speaking, his shoulder brushing mine in a way that felt like both comfort and apology. For a while, we simply watched the sunlight move across the floor, neither of us needing to fill the moment with words that might break its fragile peace. Eventually he spoke, his voice steady but softer than I had heard in days. "I didn't handle everything perfectly," he said, not looking at me directly, "but I know what I need to protect now." The sentence carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it came from clarity rather than reaction. He explained that he had ended the engagement quietly, not as punishment, but as a recognition that love built on fear could not survive without changing him into someone he didn't want to become. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a quiet acceptance that some relationships exist to teach rather than to last. I listened, feeling the relief settle slowly into my chest. Not relief that he chose me over her, but relief that he had chosen himself. The boundaries he described weren't harsh, they were thoughtful, grounded in respect rather than anger. Financial ties would be separated, expectations clarified, and the house would return to being a place of shared safety rather than silent competition. He spoke about forgiveness, too. Not immediate reconciliation, but the kind of understanding that allows people to walk away without carrying resentment as a lifelong burden. I realized then how much he had grown through this storm. He wasn't the boy who reacted to emotion anymore, nor the man who ignored discomfort to keep peace. He had become someone capable of holding truth without needing to shout it into existence. Later that afternoon, we walked through the rooms together, adjusting small things that had shifted over the past weeks, moving a chair back to its familiar place, opening windows that had stayed closed too long. And the house didn't need to be restored dramatically. It simply needed to feel lived in again. Caleb paused at the doorway and turned toward me with a faint smile that carried both gratitude and quiet regret. "I should have seen sooner," he said. I shook my head gently, reminding him that people learn when they're ready, not when others expect them to. What mattered wasn't how long it took him to understand. It was that he did. As evening settled, the calm in the house felt earned rather than accidental. There were no loud victories, no declarations of triumph, only the steady presence of two people who had survived a difficult truth without losing their dignity. Sitting by the window later that night, I watched Caleb scroll through messages before setting his phone aside, choosing stillness over distraction. He didn't look broken, and he looked reflective, as if the noise of the past few days had revealed something deeper about himself. And as the last light faded from the sky, I understood the true ending of this story wasn't about revenge or defeat. It was about balance returning quietly to a life that had nearly lost its center. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth had already done the work.